When I first arrived in Vietnam, I was sent to PHAN THIET, THAN, where the Army was conducting Operation Bird, BYRD, and had been doing so for a while. The second regiment of the 7th Cavalry or something or other. It was the 1st Air Mobile Cavalry, which was Custer's old brigade, George Custer, and it was actually Custer had been wiped out, Little Bighorn, of course, in 1870 or so. But it was the 2nd and 7th was the Gary Owen Brigade, and they had their own song. You look it up, got their own song, and it was a very proud bunch. Now, 2nd and 7th and the cavalry had arrived in PHAN THIET hot on the heels of the first real battle where American forces were used in the Drang Valley. That's IA, second word, DRANG. And apparently it was a vicious battle, indeed. Drang Valley was north and west of Pleiku, which is in the Central Highlands, and I'd get to Pleiku, and we'll get to Pleiku and talk about it later on. We had a radio station for our unit, the Pleiku. Now, I was first with the 245th Psychological Operation Company, and I was a field team. I was the 8th field team, I think. I was the 32nd Psychological Operations Detachment. All of this is confusing. When I went in the Army, I was commissioned in 1964 at William & Mary, having gone through ROTC. And then I went off and I got my master's degree and worked in TV a little bit. And then in the fall of 1966, I went in the Army to fulfill my obligation. They shipped me off to Aberdeen Proving Ground because I was commissioned as an ordnance officer. And I had, and of course, ordnance and bombs and weaponry and all that stuff. And of course, ordnance didn't know what to do with me. And so initially I was supposed to go down to supply school, but at the very last minute, as we were leaving, having spent I think we spent 9 weeks at Aberdeen Ground, kind of getting us up to speed, such as you ever would for a bunch of college kids. Different orders came through, and I was told to go to Fort Bragg and take command of the 32nd Psychological Operations Detachment, and subsequently was going to deploy to Vietnam instead of Korea. I was supposed to go to Korea. Didn't go to Korea. There were 7 Psychological Operations Detachments that were formed at Bragg. Each is a 3-man team. It's almost an absurdity. You had a lieutenant, you had a sergeant, an E6, and you had a PFC, and that was it. And my guys were a fellow by the name of Green was my sergeant, a terrible, terrible officer at this point. Poor Sergeant Green, a nice guy. Terrible. And then we had Wesley Melendez, who was from Nacogdoches. I still remember Nacogdoches, Texas. And he was just an absolutely lovable kid. We were all kids. And he was our PFC, and he had Mexican roots, I think. But there were 7 teams, and we all arrived at Fort Bragg, and where the 2nd Psychological Operations Battalion was located. and it was part of special warfare. And special warfare in those days, probably, maybe still is, consisted of the Green Berets and the psychological warfare. It had now been rebranded psychological operations. So we stayed at Bragg doing basically nothing for almost a year. And, well, let's see, it wouldn't be in a year. We'd probably get down there in December, roughly, of 66, and then we deployed in July, end of July of 67, and arrived in Vietnam at the end of August. I've covered this. Once we were ready to go, we were flown to Atlanta and then on out to San Diego. We got on the John Pope troop ship with 2,200 members of the Marines, and I think there was an Air Force contingent, and we sailed for 17 days across the ocean Pacific to White Beach, Okinawa. Spent a day in White Beach. Then we went to Da Nang, and that was another 5 days. And then we went one more day. They offloaded the Marines and everybody else, except us. And there were 21 of us and maybe another group or two. And we went down to Vung Tau, which is the port for Saigon, and it's at the end of the Vung Song Saigon, which means it's the Saigon River. And we went in and over the board and waded in with our stuff past the sunbathers and so forth. And then that late afternoon, we were flown up to Nha Trang. About an hour up to Nha Trang, and became part of the 245th Psychological Operations Company, which is located on Camp McDermott, adjacent to the Air Force Base. Now, all of this has been built by the French years ago, and when the French left in 1954, after the Battle of Bien Phu, I think, so then the U.S. moved in some troops, advisors, but by 1966, the war was cranking up, and they were beefing up the number of people there. THIET was an old French outpost. Was on top of the hill. THIET was coastal. Was on the coast of the South China Sea, and there was river water through there. And it, I don't know what the population of THIET was. It was a small little place, but they had the French airstrip and a couple of old French buildings on one end, and then way down on the other end, they'd been bombed out, something or other, and houses and so on. And obviously there'd been they mixed it up, a battle had been there at some point in the past. We had spent a couple of days at Nha Trang, and maybe more than a couple of days, and then the 245th, which is a very small little unit, they're in a Quonset hut, decided to send my team to Nha Trang, to PHAN THIET, and they took others, and I don't know, when I remember, I remember where two teams were. A fellow by the name of Mastella was up at, I think he was up at Tui Wa. Later I'd go to Tui Wa, it was up north. And a fellow by the name of Otis Brooks, loved Otis, was at Uplift, Operation Uplift. And Otis was black, and it was clearly the most dangerous of the landing zones, but LZ uplift was it was like in a valley, and it was at a couple of old highways, and this is not a place you want to be. And they got bombed and one thing and another, and of course it was it was racist. Otis was the only black in our entire contingent. And I went to see Otis later. He retired out to, or he left when he came back from Vietnam. Went to Ohio, and I went out and I spent I think a night with him or two, and I was very fond of him. And I lost track, of course, of everybody after I came back. THIET, the base was an old airstrip. It was, as I said, it's top of the hill. It was right on the South China Sea, a real cliff. And I lived in a tent and a sandy floor for these 3 months that I was there. I was there from September, October, November, and to be safe at night, we we had these ammunition cases, and you'd stack the ammunition cases up higher than your cot, and then you'd sleep on the cot. So to die at during a mortar attack, and they mortared us, which, by the way, they did not do while I was there. Anyway, you slept underneath the thing. These ammo boxes were filled with sand, and so there you were. Then rather soon, they built and I can call it nothing more than an office building, and gave me office space up by the operations center, which is called the Tactical Operations Center, better known as TOC, T-O-C, and ran our operations out of there. Now, Byrd there was virtually nothing going on. The rule here, of course, maybe largely until THIET, which was in January of 1968. THIET's when the bad guys, Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, overran a number of cities and created a lot of mischief. But when I went down to THIET, we owned the country during the day, and they owned it during the night. And but they never mortared us, and they never got close to us but they were watching our guys' tactics, and we had a lieutenant colonel and there running things, and lieutenant colonels. By the time you reach a lieutenant colonel, you're getting into the upper reaches, and towards the end of your career. If you do not make full colonel, then you're probably going to, tell you to go away. So you're working to become full colonel. Now, I was a second lieutenant when I arrived. Rather quickly, I became a first lieutenant, because after 3 years after your commissioning, you become a first lieutenant. And then I stuck around a little bit longer, and I became a captain. And because everything was moving very quickly in Vietnam in terms of rank, when I left, I was on the list to be promoted to major. And I like this. I was about as unmilitary as you can be, and but I'd had assignments where I had done really quite well. I ran this field team down in THIET, so I'd been in the field, and then we would come to the Nha Trang days when I was the head of intelligence for 2 Corps, which is about a third of South Vietnam. Head of intelligence for psychological operations, and I began traveling and seeing a lot. And then I became a captain and went down to Saigon and started this magazine, cultural magazine, which is really not linked to. It was almost non-military. We did nothing about the war, anything in that. And we'll talk about THONGCAM, THONGCAM magazine, when we talk about Saigon, which is going to be a little while before we do that. We'll tell one story and then we'll wrap it up here. And it's about Thanksgiving Day. I'd been, by Thanksgiving, end of November of 1967, I had been ordered back to Nha Trang to take over the intelligence section for what was becoming the 8th Psychological Battalion. So the 245th Company was being upgraded to a battalion, and they were now staffing up with normal staff, which is S1, supplies to operations is 3. I'm sorry, I think S4 was supply. I'm rusty about this stuff, but it's easily look up and so on. Anyway, they were the 2nd and 7th at THIET was air mobile, and so they operated in helicopters, and they would get on helicopters, load the guys up, and they'd go out somewhere, and they'd land, and they'd sweep the area and maybe engage, and maybe I did not go on. Did I go out? Well, I did go on a couple of operations, but anyway, I wasn't with them the day that they went out, the day before Thanksgiving. And this time, the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, had been doing the same tactics over and over and over, and which is not what you want to do. And this time, they lured our commanding officer to send units out into this particular area, and when they landed, they were surrounded, and 8 guys were killed on the day before Thanksgiving. And these are the first guys that were killed in our entire operation. And I've always felt that was it was a terrible thing and avoidable, because you got sucked in doing the same thing. So we're going to talk about some happier things that happened at THIET, and there are plenty of happy things that happen. But we'll get to that in our next take on THIET, which of course is the first of 3 places that I was based in my 19 months in Vietnam.